I hadn't even turned the engine off when I saw the crowd. Cars lined both sides of the dirt road that used to be empty every morning of my childhood. Strangers stood where our corn rows should have been. A white tent had been set up beside my barn. Folding chairs. A podium. And a sign. Auction today, county authorized sale. For a second I honestly thought I had the wrong address. Then I saw my name. Not on the house, not on the mailbox, but on a printed foreclosure notice stapled to the oak tree my grandfather planted in 1942. I stepped out in uniform, duffel bag still over my shoulder. 14 months overseas, and the first thing I heard back home was a woman's voice behind me. "Sir, you can't be here during the auction." I turned slowly. She was wearing an HOA badge. I laughed. I actually laughed, because there is no HOA within 3 miles of my family farm. The sheriff walked over next, resting his hand on his belt like I was the problem. "You need to leave the property." My property. Behind him, a developer was showing blueprints to investors, standing in front of my father's barn. And that's when I noticed something nailed to the fence. My family name, Carter Farm, had been painted over in red. They weren't just selling my land. They already believed it belonged to them. They just didn't know I had come home with the one thing that could destroy all of it. If you believe no one should come home from serving their country to find strangers selling their land, stay with me. Because this wasn't just a paperwork mistake, it was planned. And before this ends, the people behind it will regret ever touching Carter Farm. My name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Carter. My family has owned this farm since 1935, long before the paved roads, before the subdivisions, before anyone thought this land would be worth more than sweat and patience. My grandfather bought it after years of railroad labor, and every generation after him protected it like it was part of our bloodline. To most people it's just dirt. To us, it's history. I grew up fixing fences at sunrise with my father and feeding animals before school. Inside the farmhouse, the walls were covered with photographs, harvest seasons, military uniforms, weddings, funerals. Every Carter left a mark here. And in the corner of my grandmother's bedroom sat a locked wooden trunk she never let anyone open. She used to tell me, land isn't protected by strength, it's protected by paper. I didn't understand that then. I joined the Army after my father died during a zoning dispute hearing. He'd spent years fighting developers trying to buy the farm, and the stress finally caught him. Before I left for my first deployment, I promised my grandmother I'd come back and keep the place running. 14 months overseas changes your sense of time. Mail arrives late, phone calls are short, and home feels frozen in place. I paid my property taxes online when I could and assumed everything was normal. But while I was gone, the town changed. A gated neighborhood appeared beside our fields. An HOA formed. Roads were extended. And somewhere in those new maps, someone quietly drew a line around my farm and decided it belonged to them too. By the time I came home, the entire town already believed the land wasn't mine anymore. I was just the last person to find out. The next morning I drove straight to the HOA office. It wasn't hard to find. Glass walls, polished stone sign, landscaped entrance, the kind of building that tries to look official without actually being government. My boots left dust across their spotless lobby floor while everyone inside stared like I had walked into the wrong place. Maybe to them, I had. A receptionist asked my name, typed it once, then looked up differently the second time she read it. "Please wait. The board will see you." The board. They sat behind a long table like a courtroom panel, HOA president in the center, a developer in a suit beside her, and a lawyer flipping through a folder thicker than a field manual. My entire life was apparently summarized in paperwork. The president smiled politely. "Mr. Carter, your property has been classified as part of the Silver Ridge residential community under County Adjustment Code. You've been non-compliant for 14 months. I told her I was deployed overseas. The lawyer didn't even look up. That does not suspend civil obligations. They slid documents across the table: unpaid association dues, maintenance penalties, administrative fees, legal processing charges. The total was more than my yearly military salary. Then came the part that didn't make sense. Due to abandonment indicators, she continued, the association has authority to initiate seizure and auction. Abandonment. My house. My barn. My family's land since 1935. I showed them my deployment orders. The lawyer glanced once and pushed them back across the table like they were a receipt from a grocery store. You may dispute after the sale. After the sale. Outside, the county sheriff was already waiting near my truck. He wasn't aggressive, just tired, like he'd already been told how this was going to end. Auction scheduled in 72 hours, he said. Best you make arrangements. When I got back to the farm that evening, the front door locks had been changed. I slept in the driver's seat of my truck, parked on land they were preparing to sell without me in it. By the second day, it stopped feeling like a dispute and started feeling like a countdown. A black SUV pulled onto the dirt road just after sunrise. The developer stepped out alone, dressed casual this time, like we were neighbors having a friendly conversation instead of strangers fighting over land. He handed me a folder. Inside was an offer, more money than the farm had ever produced in a single year. Enough to make most people walk away quietly. You've served your country, he said calmly. You deserve a fresh start somewhere else. Somewhere else. I told him no. His smile didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Then the auction will. That afternoon the fines tripled. Overnight penalties appeared online: landscaping violations, safety hazards, abandoned structure fees. Even the barn door suddenly counted as a liability. Every hour I refreshed the page, the total climbed higher. I drove to the county records office to request the original property file. The clerk barely looked at me before saying it was unavailable. Digitization backlog. But behind her desk, I could see newer files stacked neatly in labeled boxes. Mine was the only one missing. Back at the farm, equipment I hadn't touched yet was already tagged with removal stickers. Someone had marked my fence posts with orange paint, survey markings. They weren't preparing for a sale. They were preparing for construction. That night a notice appeared taped to my truck window. Final opportunity, signed before auction. No name. No signature. I went into the farmhouse attic hoping to find old records my grandmother kept. The wooden document box I remembered from childhood was still there, but empty. Clean empty. Not dusty, not disturbed, intentionally cleared out. That's when it hit me. They weren't confident they were right. They were confident I couldn't prove they were wrong. That night I didn't sleep in the truck. I sat on the porch steps with my back against the door, staring across fields that used to calm me down after bad days overseas. Usually, wide open space makes things quiet inside your head. Not this time. The distant thump of a survey helicopter kept circling overhead, and every pass dragged me somewhere I didn't want to go: desert air, rotor wash, dust in my teeth, waiting for something to explode that you couldn't see yet. Back there, you learn control is an illusion. Orders come, things change, and you just react. Standing on my own land, I felt the same way. No enemy I could see. No line I could defend. Just paperwork slowly closing in. For the first time since I got home, I wondered if the developer was right. Maybe fighting this was pointless. Courts take years. Lawyers cost money I didn't have. The town had already decided the outcome. I drove to the cemetery before sunrise and sat beside my father's grave. The grass hadn't grown evenly yet. I'd been gone when they buried him. I tried, I told the headstone. But I think they beat me. The words tasted wrong. As I stood up to leave, I remembered my grandmother's voice, not gentle, not comforting, but certain. Land survives because proof survives. She never trusted banks. Never trusted county offices. And she never kept important things where anyone expected them to be. I had checked the attic. But the attic was the obvious place. For the first time since the auction notice went up, I felt a small piece of control come back. Maybe I hadn't looked in the right place yet. Auction day looked less like a legal process and more like an event. By mid-morning, cars lined both sides of the dirt road. People carried coffee cups and lawn chairs like they were attending a parade instead of watching someone lose their home. A white canopy tent stood beside my barn, and a folding stage had been set up facing the field. Behind it hung a glossy banner showing a digital rendering of the neighborhood expansion, paved streets, identical houses, artificial ponds placed exactly where our corn rows used to grow. My land already redesigned. The auctioneer tested a microphone while the HOA board gathered near the stage, speaking with investors. The developer walked them through blueprints, pointing to the farmhouse as if it were already gone. A few people recognized me standing by the fence, but most didn't say anything. They just looked, then looked away. The sheriff approached slowly. "I told you how today was going to go," he said quietly. "Don't make it harder on yourself." Harder. I watched strangers step across the grass my father spent years leveling after floods. Someone leaned against the old oak tree, the one with the foreclosure notice still stapled to it. No one asked permission. No one hesitated. Because to them, it was already public property. A group of local veterans showed up near the road. They didn't interfere, just stood together in silence. One nodded at me. Another avoided eye contact completely. Even support felt uncertain when paperwork said I was wrong. The auctioneer raised the microphone. "By authority of County Lien Enforcement and Residential Association Compliance Code." Pause. The word slipped out of me before I planned it. Every head turned. Cameras lifted instantly, not for me, but for disruption. The HOA president's smile tightened like she had rehearsed this moment. "Sir, you've been notified. You no longer have standing here." I held up my deployment orders anyway. Not for them, for the crowd. 14 months. Date stamped across 2 continents. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others didn't care. The lawyer stepped forward. "Military service does not exempt private obligations." The owner failed to respond to notices. Failed to respond. A woman in the audience whispered he should have handled his bills before leaving. Someone else nodded. Humiliation doesn't come from yelling. It comes from agreement. The sheriff placed a hand lightly on my arm, not forceful, just guiding, and walked me past the fence line. I didn't resist. I just watched. The auctioneer restarted. Opening bid. A hand immediately raised, the developer's representative. Too fast. Too prepared. The number wasn't negotiation, it was confirmation. No one else bid. They weren't meant to. This had never been a public auction. It was a transfer ceremony. As the second call echoed across the field, a sudden argument broke out near the road. A pickup truck had blocked an arriving news van, and reporters began filming the commotion. Cameras turned from the stage toward the confrontation, and the auctioneer paused again, annoyed. Minutes passed. People murmured. The flow of the event cracked just enough to feel unstable. Then a county assistant hurried onto the stage and whispered to the auctioneer. His confident posture changed. He adjusted the microphone. "We are temporarily holding proceedings for administrative confirmation." Confusion spread instantly. The HOA president pulled her lawyer aside. Their conversation went from controlled to urgent. The developer stopped smiling. No explanation. Just delay. The crowd shifted from spectators to witnesses. A veteran beside me muttered, "Something's wrong." For the first time all morning, nobody looked certain, not the buyers, not the board, not even the sheriff. I didn't know what had interrupted the sale yet. But whatever it wasn't part of their plan. While the crowd waited, a young woman stepped out of the county records van parked near the road. She wasn't dressed like the others, no suit, no badge display, just a folder clutched tight against her chest like she wasn't sure she should even be holding it. She walked straight toward me, hesitated once, then spoke quietly. "Staff Sergeant Carter?" I nodded. She glanced back at the stage before handing me a folded sheet of paper. "I'm not supposed to do this, but you need to see it before they finish." It wasn't a deed. It was a survey map, old, hand-drawn lines overlaid with modern digital markings. My property boundary was outlined in heavy ink, dated decades before the neighborhood existed. At the bottom sat a classification stamp I'd never heard mentioned before. Agricultural Preservation Tract, Pre-Residential Jurisdiction. I looked up at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said carefully, "the HOA can fine you, but they may not have authority to seize the land. Not unless the original deed surrendered exemption status." On the stage, the lawyer was arguing with a county official now. The developer's posture had changed, arms crossed, jaw tight. "They're saying the map isn't enforceable without the primary deed record," she continued. "And the archived copy is missing." Missing. The realization landed slowly. They weren't delaying because they doubted the sale. They were delaying because they needed confirmation I couldn't produce proof. I folded the paper carefully. For the first time since coming home, the fight wasn't over. It had just changed rules. I left the crowd before the auction restarted. No speeches. No confrontation. Just walked past the fence, got into my truck, and drove back to the farmhouse while everyone else argued over paperwork I suddenly understood mattered more than opinions. The survey map sat on the passenger seat the whole drive. Not unless the original deed surrendered exemption status. My grandmother never trusted offices. She said records get copied, moved, misfiled, but originals survive only if families protect them themselves. I'd searched the attic already, the obvious place. And whoever cleared the document box had expected me to stop there. So I didn't go back upstairs. I went to her bedroom. The room hadn't changed since she passed. Curtains drawn halfway, sewing machine by the window, the same quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Most people remember furniture. I remembered habits. She never kept important things where a thief would search first, and she assumed anyone looking would start high, not low. I knelt beside the old treadle sewing machine and ran my hand under the wooden base. Metal touched my fingers. A small cylindrical tube was taped inside the frame, hidden behind the pedal housing where no one would notice unless they knew exactly what to feel for. The tape had turned brittle with age. I slid it loose and held it in both hands. Heavy. Inside was an oil-wrapped roll of paper. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it was before I saw it. Some things carry weight even through layers. When I finally unrolled it across the kitchen table, the parchment resisted at the folds. Thick fibers. Handwritten ink. County seal pressed deep enough to leave texture. The date at the top read 1935. And at the bottom, beneath the signatures, a clause stamped in bold. Agricultural Preservation Grant, property exempt from future residential incorporation without owner consent. I exhaled slowly. The HOA didn't just lack authority. They legally couldn't have authority, ever. Unless someone proved the exemption had been surrendered. Which required the original document. The one the county claimed was missing. I took photos immediately and called the only lawyer who had bothered to return my message, a veteran legal aid attorney in the next town over. He answered on the second ring, impatient until I read him the clause word for word. Silence. Then, do not let that out of your possession. I'm filing an emergency injunction right now. Within minutes he called back again, voice sharper. The county archive copy was removed 2 months ago. Logged as transfer for digitization. Never returned. Meaning lost? Meaning someone didn't want it found. Back at the auction site, the delay had stretched into an argument. I returned just as the lawyer was telling the board they could proceed if no proof appeared. The crowd was restless now, less entertainment, more tension. I didn't go to the stage. I handed the folded deed to the sheriff. He frowned, opened it carefully, then looked toward the county officials. They gathered around, reading in silence. The reaction spread person by person: confusion, recognition, then immediate concern. The HOA attorney stepped closer. "That document hasn't been authenticated." My lawyer's voice came through my phone speaker. "It doesn't need authentication to halt sale. It establishes probable exemption status. Continue and you risk unlawful seizure liability." The sheriff handed the deed to the county representative, who visibly paled. The developer stopped speaking entirely. Minutes later, the auctioneer stepped back to the microphone. "Proceedings are suspended pending judicial review." No applause. No cheering. Just a shift in the air, certainty draining out of the people who'd arrived expecting a transaction and leaving unsure what they had just witnessed. My lawyer texted seconds after. "Hearing scheduled this afternoon. Bring the original." As the crowd dispersed, the HOA president stared at me, not angry, not confident anymore, calculating. Because now the fight wasn't about unpaid dues. It was about who tried to erase a document that legally protected my land for 90 years. And courts take document tampering personally. By the afternoon, the courthouse didn't look like a place for routine hearings anymore. News vans lined the street. Cameras waited on the steps. The same people who treated the auction like entertainment now stood outside trying to understand how it had turned into a legal emergency. Inside, every bench in the courtroom was filled: residents, reporters, even some of the investors from that morning. The HOA board sat together at one table. The developer at another. Their lawyer moved between them, whispering constantly, confidence replaced by urgency. My attorney placed the rolled deed carefully in front of the judge. "Your Honor, we request immediate injunction and investigation into unlawful seizure attempt." The HOA lawyer stood quickly. "This document has not been authenticated and cannot be relied upon to halt civil enforcement." The judge didn't answer. He unfolded the parchment slowly instead. The room went quiet. He ran a finger across the pressed county seal, then leaned closer to read the exemption clause. His expression didn't change, but he reached for his glasses, a small movement that somehow felt louder than an objection. "Counsel," he said calmly, "explain why a property marked agricultural preservation exempt was processed under residential HOA authority." The HOA lawyer hesitated. "Our understanding is the exemption record is not present in county archives." My attorney responded immediately. "Because it was removed 2 months prior to lien filing." A murmur moved across the courtroom. The judge turned toward the county records supervisor seated behind the defense table. "Is that statement accurate?" She shifted in her chair. "The record was transferred for digitization." "And returned?" "Not yet." My attorney placed printed emails onto the evidence table, internal communications between the developer and a county clerk requesting expedited boundary confirmation before auction authorization. Another document followed, timestamp logs showing the archive accessed the night before the record disappeared. The HOA lawyer objected rapidly, voice tightening. "Speculation." "Overruled," the judge said, sharper now. A projector screen lit behind him displaying survey maps, old boundary lines layered over the new subdivision. The farm sat clearly outside residential jurisdiction unless exemption consent existed. There was no such consent on record. The judge leaned back, studying both sides. "Let me be clear," he said. "If this court finds an attempt was made to bypass exemption protections through removal of archival documentation, the matter moves beyond civil enforcement." Silence. The developer stared at the table. The HOA president stopped writing notes entirely. My attorney spoke once more. "We also submit military deployment documentation establishing inability to respond to notices during active overseas service." The judge nodded slightly. He looked down at the deed one final time before speaking. "The court grants immediate injunction. The auction is void. All liens are suspended pending investigation." Relief didn't come immediately, just stillness. Then the second part followed. The court orders referral to the district attorney regarding potential records tampering and fraudulent seizure attempt. The reaction was instant. Reporters stood. Cameras flashed. The HOA lawyer closed his folder slowly, no longer arguing. The developer's confidence from that morning was gone completely. The judge struck the gavel once. Property remains under ownership of Staff Sergeant Marcus Carter until further ruling. Court adjourned. Outside the courtroom, the same crowd that watched my land being sold now watched the people who tried to sell it walk past microphones in silence. By sunset, the auction signs were already being removed. And for the first time since coming home, the land felt quiet again. By the next morning, the white auction tent was gone. Tire tracks still cut through the grass, but the crowd had disappeared, leaving the farm the way it was meant to be, open, quiet, and finally mine again. The county posted an official notice at the road confirming the sale had been voided pending investigation. No banners. No investors. Just wind moving through the fields. A few neighbors stopped by without cameras this time. No one had much to say. They just helped me pull the foreclosure sign off the oak tree and carry it to the burn barrel. One of the veterans who stood by the fence the day before stayed late to help reset the posts where survey markers had been driven into the soil. I hung a new wooden sign at the entrance before sunset. Carter Farm, EST 1935. Inside the house, I wrapped the original deed in fresh oil paper and placed it back into my grandmother's trunk, not hidden, just protected. Some battles are loud. Some are fought quietly with patience and proof. This one wasn't about winning land. It was about keeping a promise. And promises, like land, last longer when you defend them properly.